Thanks to the launch of the fantastic Sega Genesis Mini last year, I have shared my thoughts on Sega's groundbreaking 16-bit platform quite a bit on this channel. It was not just an incredible machine to be entertained by, but for me personally, it also allowed me to visualize the future and potential of the video game medium, and eventually it led me to creating the Electric Playground. So needless to say, I love lots of games on the Sega Genesis, and it's been very difficult for me to pick a first 5, and I recommend that you actually check out our playlist for the Sega Genesis Mini, where you'll find lots of quick reviews on tons of great games. Now, I'm going to give you my first 5 for the Sega Genesis in a bit, but I wanted to start with some very qualified experts who can give us their choices for their first 5s, and we're going to start with Sam Machkovech from Ars Technica.
Hey Victor, I am excited to talk about the Sega Genesis first 5 because there are so many ways to get into the Sega Genesis library. Look up there, I've got one of the new plug-and-play sets made by Sega. It's quite good. I have a newer hardware emulation option, connects via HDMI. You can put in a flash cart and play a bunch of games. And of course, the old CRT guys work pretty well too. So this is my jam, so let's go. Thunder Force 2. There's an argument to be made about any game in the Thunder Force series as one of the best options for a new Sega Genesis fan. Thunder Force 2 to me is the one that is so different from anything else in the modern era. If you want to go back to 1989 and feel something that you don't see anymore, its mix of top-down and side-scrolling action, its objective-based combat, its really interesting twist on shooting in multiple directions based on how you upgrade, was an archetype that a lot of other shooters built upon later, but Thunder Force 2 to me is the most unique one of the series.
Go!
Streets of Rage 2 is the Genesis side-scrolling beat-em-up. There's a lot of these. You could even go on the Sega CD to get Final Fight, which is quite good. But Streets of Rage 2 sounds amazing, feels amazing. It really pushes the hardware to its limits in a way that still feels really good to play with a friend on the couch. The Yamaha chipset for sound that was in that old hardware is still beloved for the kind of crunching tones that make it sound like a true club banger of a game. NBA Jam Tournament Edition. I picked this for a couple reasons. Number one, you can get it for really cheap as a cartridge if you're building a legitimate collection. And number two, it's just the best version that you can play at home on a system. It didn't really get a good 32-bit or 64-bit port because it became Hang Time and some of these other Showtime, some of these other spin-offs. It just felt amazing. The balance of 3 buttons, turbo, shoot, and pass, work really well on the Genesis. Even though it's downgraded from the original arcade version, it just feels right. I still like playing this 2-player on a Genesis, and you want to get a Genesis as a 2-player system, so put this near the top of your 16-bit 2-player library. Ecco the Dolphin. There's no other game like it for any of the 16-bit systems. It's almost a Nintendo-style game, the way it emphasizes this chill, weird atmosphere. You're exploring, you're zipping around, you're digging through caverns, you're sending sonar waves to uncover a mysterious mystery. You're a dolphin, swimming around, eating tiny fish. It's just something really singular. You're not going to find an experience like this on modern systems. It honestly out-indies a lot of modern indie games. So yeah, get in that dolphin party. Shining Force. I love tactical JRPGs. I'm much more into these than I am into the sort of grindy, fight over and over sort of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games that you find on older systems. And I think Shining Force really nailed a bunch of stuff in its first version that we had to wait years for Final Fantasy Tactics and Fire Emblem and other series to catch up on. It still plays really well. It still feels like a fresh, interesting, long, narrative-heavy quest.
Next up, we have the incomparable Johnliniment from Digital Foundry and DF Retro.
Here's my picks for the first 5 games anyone should play when they get their hands on the Genesis. First up, Sega's seminal The Revenge of Shinobi, or the Super Shinobi in Japan. Released in 1989, just a little over a year after the console launched in Japan, The Revenge of Shinobi is a sequel of sorts to the original arcade game, but manages to improve and expand upon nearly every aspect of it. There's a huge range of stages packed in, and each of them delivers a very focused challenge which perfectly suits the methodical gameplay. This is a game of precision where timing matters. You can't just mash your way through it. The game demands that players learn and adapt to increasingly complex situations, which is a huge part of the fun. It's a game that scratches an itch similar to something like Castlevania, I suppose, but with its own sense of style. This is then coupled with gorgeous pixel art graphics and a killer soundtrack, composed by the legendary Yuzo Koshiro. Next up is Treasure's remarkable Dynamite Heady. Treasure made a name for itself with Gunstar Heroes, but Heady takes things to the next level. This game encapsulates everything I love about Treasure. It's beautiful and it sounds great, yes, but it's the sheer variety that blows me away. Each level is composed of a series of stages, each boasting unique mechanics and ideas that build on the core gameplay mechanics. It's a perfect mix of brilliant boss battles and fast action platforming. The head swapping mechanic is at the center of everything, of course. Heady's abilities are directly tied to the various heads you'll pick up during the game, and this, coupled with the stage design, leads to something that feels so satisfying to master. Yes, it can be difficult to pick up and play the very first time, but stick with it and I think you'll find one of the best 2D action games ever made. Next though, we have one of the most recognizable games in the system, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Anyone that's experienced Sega's past has likely played one of its 16-bit Sonic games, but even still, it's a series that is so important to my gaming history that I couldn't help but include one here. Sonic 2 just happens to be my favorite of the bunch. It expands upon the original Sonic game, but still avoids the overly lengthy levels of Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It feels like a perfect middle ground, actually. It's one of those games that you can kind of play over and over again. Sonic 2 also makes great use of the Sega Genesis hardware with a near flawless choice of color palette, lots of advanced line scrolling, and excellent sprite work that looks better than the games that would follow. There's no CGI looking rendered Sonic here. Next up, we're entering the world of Konami with Rocket Knight Adventures, an exclusive game for the Genesis. Now, this is how to do an action game. Rocket Knight fuses perfect play mechanics with unbelievably creative design decisions and levels. It was designed as a situation rush game of sorts, basically a concept which focuses on throwing a series of bespoke challenges at the player that are all built upon based on what they've learned over the course of the game. Rocket Knight is constantly throwing new ideas at the player, and it never lets up. It also demonstrates Konami's ability to push hardware to the absolute limits. Unlike many of its Super NES games, which are often plagued with slowdown, Rocket Knight throws a ton of sprites around the screen while utilizing so many unique visual tricks without ever skipping a beat. But we're not done with Konami just yet. My fifth and final game to check out is Castlevania Bloodlines. I've always been a diehard fan of the Castlevania series, and Bloodlines is one of my favorites. It's also one of the most unique. Like many of Konami's other Genesis titles, it's a game that builds upon what the series was known for while delivering its own unique aesthetic. Rather than traveling through Dracula's castle, you'll visit various cities around Europe, each with its own often bizarre design language. While the fundamentals of Castlevania are certainly in check, these unique stages all wind up feeling different from anything else in the series. As a result, it's a hugely memorable and also very challenging journey. You have access to two different characters this time as well, which can influence progression in certain stages.
Now let's hear from the very clever Joe Redifer from Gamesack.
Hey guys, I'm Joe from Gamesack, and I've got 5 games I want to talk to you about, and they're all exclusive to the Genesis. Well, except for the ones that aren't. Games like Castle of Illusion, which I got in 1990. Has it been that long? This one is great for the entire family. It's not very difficult, yet still I play and beat it several times per year, and I enjoy it immensely each and every time, so it's, like I said, great fun for everybody. You must check this one out. Next up is the Genesis version of Ghouls and Ghosts, which I've heard that Yuji Naka of Sonic the Hedgehog fame worked on. This is a fantastic port. There are lots of ports out there. The Genesis version is a great one, and it's a good one for everyone because it has a practice mode. However, the true pros play on professional. You know, hardly anyone ever mentions the Genesis version of Ghostbusters. I don't know why they don't. It's a great game. It's made by Compile, who made Golvelius on the Master System and R-Type on the Master System, and oh yeah, they made Musha, which a lot of people like. But they also made this, and it's a 2D side-scrolling platformer. It's nothing like the NES and Master System versions. Instead, this one's good. Its biggest flaw is that it's missing Winston, and that is a huge oversight. If you can get past that, definitely check this one out. It's amazing. You know, I love Thunder Force 2. It was the first game I purchased when I got my Genesis console. So of course it makes sense that I was super looking forward to Thunder Force 3. In fact, I was looking forward to this so much that I imported the Japanese Mega Drive copy, which I still have. Incredible shooter, not very difficult. Anyone can get into this one right away. Amazing graphics, incredible music, and it's all in a 4 megabit cartridge. I don't know how they squeeze it all in such a small amount of space, but you need to play this game. My final pick is kind of an odd one. It's an early 4 megabit game called Mystic Defender. It's a spiritual sequel to a game called Spellcaster on the Master System, but this one is action only, no adventure overtones at all. There are lots of different weapons to collect, and this one is a great one that you can pull down from the shelf and play pretty much any time, and I do that a lot. Definitely recommended.
And how about we turn things over to Mike Mika, classic game collector and studio head of Other Ocean.
One of the first games I bought for the Sega Genesis was Zany Golf by Will Harvey and Electronic Arts. It's a really cool isometric mini golf game that looks great and plays even better. It has up to 4 players that can play at once, and it has probably some of the best party game mechanics you can expect. It feels like a mini golf game, but it starts to go quickly down the rabbit hole to a very video game fantasy version of mini golf. Another great game on the Sega Genesis is Alien Soldier by Treasure. It's by the same team that brought you Gunstar Heroes, and like Gunstar Heroes, it's super technically impressive. It's got these incredible effects, it's visually stunning, and unlike some of the other Treasure-style games, it's not only just a great shooter, but it's really focused on a boss rush style of gameplay. These super impressive full-screen bosses with incredible mechanics and puzzles that you have to figure out to defeat each boss makes it feel more like a Sega Saturn game or even like a current indie title than a game that you would have played back in the 90s on the Sega Genesis. I can't recommend more highly the game X Ranza by Gao Entertainment. It's also known as Ranger X here in North America. It's a shining example of what the Sega Genesis could do technically. I think they use every one of the 512 colors. They introduce 3D wireframe animation in all the cutscenes. There's so many sprites. I think they use every sprite, all 80 sprites of the Sega Genesis at once on screen. And it happens to be just a really good game. You're this guy who's Ranger X, who pilots a powered exoskeleton, and he's fighting off all these invading forces to his planet. And you have the ability to fuse with what's kind of like a unicycle, and you have a jetpack, and you have to worry about overheating, and there's so much firepower in the game that while the screen gets full of action, and there's so many bullets flying everywhere, at the end of the day, everything is drawn so articulately, and it looks so good. You can follow all the action. All that doesn't interfere with the joy you're having with the game. Another favorite game of mine for the Sega Genesis is Papenga Pengo. It's an import game from Japan. I remember reading about it, and it was kind of like legendary because I was a huge fan of the classic arcade game Pengo. I had every version of it. I had the Atari 2600 version and a Commodore 64 version. It's one of my favorite games. So the fact that they actually decided to make a new game for the Sega Genesis at a time when Pengo was almost a distant memory is mind-blowing. This is in the time and era of Bomberman, which was really popular. I loved Bomberman. So they introduced this new game mode that allows 4 players to use Pengo mechanics, the ability to push blocks and try to smash things against one another. That was a whole new level of Pengo I was never anticipating, and it's so fun. I highly recommend it. And if you're a big fan of the classic arcade game, this is that and more, graphically more beautiful, way more fun to play, and just way better tuned controls and mechanics. Desert Strike by Electronic Arts hits pretty much every note that I enjoy in video games. I was an avid fan of this classic game called Choplifter that came out for the Apple II and Commodore 64. So now fast forward years and years later to the Sega Genesis, and EA produced this game called Desert Strike, which is essentially Choplifter, but isometric. You now have to rescue down pilots and hostages, but also you go on very specific missions to take down all kinds of targets, from radar dishes to munitions and to airports. You now have more weapons, you have missiles. It's a really cool game. The graphics are amazing, and it's an exemplary example of what makes the Genesis so good, because it's fast, fluid, and there's so much action on screen.
I also wanted to hear from people that were there at Sega when the Sega Genesis was in its prime. And first up, we've got esteemed game producer, the creator of Ecco the Dolphin, and he's also got a new game out there for the Nintendo Switch called Space War Arena. Here's Ed Annunziata.
Number 5, Revenge of Shinobi. The reason why I picked Revenge of Shinobi is like one of the first Genesis games I ever played. And I remember experiencing the game feeling like the developers wanted to make an experience, not just make a game. But I felt like, from the very first moment, when the way the game starts with Shinobi and then the sword blocking the stars, and the whole thing just felt like, it felt very cinematic. It was like the first cinematic moment I ever felt in a game. The other thing too that I loved about Shinobi is the gameplay was perfect. There was a mechanic like a jump and then a jump flip, and I love that so much. That's why I ripped it off for Shakan the Forever Man. And what was good about that mechanic is not only you jump and you flip and you extend your jump, but while Shinobi is flipping, if you attack, the attack goes in all directions, which is really, really cool. Number 4 is Gunstar Heroes. I know you know this game. This is the game, like, you remember the blast processing? So this game was blast processing. I'm certain that the programmers and the designers worked, or either they were the same people or they worked very tightly together, because the game loop and the display technology trick that they used and the gameplay all was so tightly intertwined. It was just a perfect blast processing kind of game. Number 3 is Castle of Illusion. I remember playing this game and feeling envy. The team that created this game did such a good job, and the game was so well crafted. I just felt jealous. And it wasn't that they did a good job and they were going to be successful. It's that I could feel how much they loved working on this title. Like every single moment, every frame of animation, every sound effect was just perfect. All right, number 2 is Road Rash from Electronic Arts. I was in this really unique position. I was working at Sega of America, and then Sega made a deal with Electronic Arts for them to publish their games on the Genesis. So some of the games would come through our office for like third-party approval. So I'd grab a cartridge and check out what Electronic Arts was doing. And I got this Road Rash, man. And I went into my office, I closed the door, and I played that game all day. And usually, like the driving game, back in those days, the driving games were like a cool, like sort of 3D road effect and give you the feeling of going forward, and then scaling sprites to make it feel like, oh yeah, we're going forward. Oh look, I can steer left and right. But Road Rash was the first like driving game that actually had the feel of driving, and like my mind would feel it. And then that night, I'm driving home, and I'm driving a car. It's not a motorcycle. But I still feel like I could go in and out of the traffic. I was like, wow, loved Road Rash because of that. All right, so number 1, and this is a hard one to figure out, but finally I calculated it, and it's Ghouls and Ghosts. Capcom's Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis was fantastic. There's a couple of things that were perfect about that game. When I started playing it, being like a game designer, I was all, how superior am I that if I had the little guy, I would make it so that you could control him in the air after you jump. But they made it just so the guy would just go straight up and down. And I realized after playing it actually made the game better because it focused you on timing rather than, analog movement in the air. So that grabbed me. It was like, wow, I think that was a good design decision. Then I started playing the game, and there was a thing about Ghouls and Ghosts, like after you beat a level or stage or whatever it's called, when you beat it, it would show you the future stages, like in like a radar view, and you would see like weird shit going on, like, and then I would realize that it's like, oh man, what's going to happen next? I have no idea. So it was always a surprise. Yeah, that game was weird and very enjoyable. Played it all the way through, and at the end it was like, oh, you got to play it all the way through again to get to the real ending. I didn't do that, but I did get through the entire game and loved it very much.
That is awesome. Okay, give us a bonus one. Give us the one game that is your favorite that you worked on.
In terms of gameplay, like the amount of hours playing the game that I worked on, I would have to say Warriors of the Eternal Sun, because those are like a, RPG game, like 200 hours to beat it, and I had to constantly play it through. So I played it a lot, but then I really fell in love with the way that game plays, and that the real-time combat, but still using Dungeons and Dragons rules, really made that game a lot of fun.
And our last guest for this Sega Genesis First 5 is the former CEO and president of Sega of America, who oversaw the company at the height of its hardware powers. Here is Tom Kalinske.
Of course, my very favorite is Sonic 2, followed by Sonic 1. And here's actually, I don't know if you can see it, this is a Sonic 2 cartridge that we included. It's one of those that it's marked on it, it says not for resale. I just think Sonic 2, in terms of gameplay, was the best Sonic game that we ever did. I think it's still one of the best all time that has been done. I really enjoyed it, and I think it also, Sonic 1 was very important to the company and got us really going. Sonic 2 kind of set us apart and made people realize that we really were to develop great games, and helped us in our quest to pass Nintendo and share market. Joe Montana Football was one of my favorite games because it got us really going in sports and was actually selling better than Madden Football for quite a while. And Ecco the Dolphin, because it's a work of art. It's a beautiful playing game. It's fun to play. It feels good. Just gorgeous. Streets of Rage was, for me, it's how does a game feel? How does it really feel in your hands? Back in those days, I thought Streets of Rage, the ability to control, you felt like you were really in the game. You really could suspend disbelief and you became the characters in the game. One I'll tell you that it's kind of one of my favorite stories is Fantasia. The story on Fantasia is really something. We're working on it. We're almost done with it. We've sent it to Disney for final approval. I get a call from the president of Disney Interactive. Can't ship it. And I said, well, why? And he said, I'll fly up and I'll tell you tomorrow. Meet me at SFO Airport. He says to me, it's not your fault at all. Before Walt Disney passed away, before he died, he said a dictum to all of us that we could not license Fantasia. None of us knew about this. We obviously licensed it to you to do. In return, to their credit, said, we will make this up to you. Lower royalty rates or guarantees on future Disney products. And here it is. Here's one that didn't get destroyed that I still have. And it's a thing of beauty. I have another one that I played actually out of the wrapper, and it is a thing of beauty. It's a great game.
What a tremendous honor to hear from all of these wonderful people. Thank you, gentlemen. Now, it's time for my first 5. Number 5, Battletech. Now, this game came out in 1994. It was developed by Malibu Interactive. It's an isometric action game, and you are in control of a giant mech, although everything is kind of itty-bitty. It evoked a little bit of that same vibe as the Strike series from Electronic Arts, where you were kind of hovering over everything. But in this one, you get to pilot this giant mech, and you get to crush through buildings and shoot at different little tanks, little itty-bitty tanks, and blow up all kinds of installations. Eventually, you're going to get confronted by by other mechs, and it just felt so cool. It was just such a really slick sci-fi escape. I loved this freaking game. It was one that I went out to the store and paid top dollar for my Sega Genesis, and it's one that I will never give up because it's still such a tremendous blast to play. I also love the Strike games, but there's something about being able to dive into this Mech Warrior Battletech sci-fi universe and have so much fun piloting this giant robot. I love this game. Number 4 is The Adventures of Batman and Robin, which was published by Sega and developed by Clockwork Tortoise. And it took me a long time to kind of appreciate this game. And if you've been watching my 16-bit superhero segments, you know how much I have recently fallen in love with it. Crazy over-the-top run-and-gun action. You're going to be dealing with lots of enemies on screen and lots of things to avoid, lots of bullets coming your way. But if you can kind of contend with its difficulty, you're going to find something that's incredibly well-crafted, so tuned, it feels a bit like a treasure game. They did an amazing job just tuning every precise pixel in here. It's also got terrific music, 2-player support, so you can play cooperatively as Batman and Robin, and you fight all kinds of great Batman bad guys in the style of that classic Batman animated series. It is a love letter to Batman fanatics out there, but also just fans of out-and-out action games. The Adventures of Batman and Robin is unbelievable. Now, number 3 is a game called Comic Zone, which Sega developed and published in 1995, and you're probably going to see a few superhero things on this list. I apologize, but I love superhero video games, and there were tons of good ones for the Genesis, but this was a very unique one. It wasn't a licensed superhero. It was all crafted for the game, and the idea was so cool. It was about an artist that is designing his own comic book and gets sucked into his own creation. He becomes a superhero in the panels of the pages that he's drawing. So you're actually fighting through comic book panels. You'll bust through one panel and go into the next one, and then you'll punch a bad guy and he will tear apart a panel, and you'll be able to leap forward into the other one. You'll be collecting all kinds of power-ups and hucking dynamite and stuff at bad guys. You've got a pet rat that will go out and search for all kinds of objects, and you're constantly interacting with the world that's outside of the book and also within the book. And it's kind of like one of those 16-bit games that I go back to every time I get a Sega Genesis collection, or it was on the Sega Genesis Mini. This is one of the first games that I play, and it kind of reminds me of how I am addicted to playing Super Metroid on whatever Nintendo collection comes together around the Super Nintendo. This is almost equivalent for me. I always dive right towards Comic Zone because it was so unique. And Sega, if you are watching this video, please make something new with this idea. It was an idea that was so ahead of its time and so original that Sega actually patented the idea of playing through a comic book in 1994, which makes this game incredibly special. You gotta check out Comic Zone. Now, number 2 on my list is Earthworm Jim. This is the classic from Shiny Entertainment, and this was crafted by a brand new company at the time, founded by David Perry. He left Virgin Interactive with his buddies, and he created a brand new video game company to create original ideas, and he was working with the toy maker Playmates to bring his vision to life, and their first game was Earthworm Jim, which was completely crazy. It was such a wacky idea to turn an earthworm into a superhero with this super suit, and because he's an earthworm, he's got all kinds of crazy abilities like being able to whip and swing across obstructions. But what was really impressive about this game, because a lot of these vets that had worked at Virgin on games like Aladdin and Cool Spot, they had so much talent. They just filled this game with lots of diversity in the challenges and lots of great animations, incredible music. Tommy Tallarico did all the music for this game. And it was just loaded with creativity. So every time you sat down and played this game, you got a kind of a different experience out of it because of all the tangents and the weirdness that was coming off the screen. And there were so many crazy characters and so much, just joy coming out of this game that it ended up becoming an animated series and a toy line and comic books. And pretty soon we're actually going to get an Earthworm Jim 3 on the new Intellivision, which I can't wait for. Now, number 1 on my Sega Genesis first 5 list is X-Men 2 Clone Wars, which came out in 1995, so everybody was starting to think about the next generation of consoles, including Sega's own Saturn. But X-Men 2 on Genesis really benefited from lots of great ideas that had crossed over 16-bit superhero titles, and I think it is the best one. I think that there's so many great pillars to this game. First of all of these different X-Men that you get to play: Wolverine, Psylocke, Nightcrawler, Beast, Gambit, and Cyclops. And then you can also unlock Magneto. The storylines in the game followed the storylines that we saw in the comic books. Lots of diversity in the level design, fantastic music, cooperative play, so you could play as two X-Men through these challenges. The game even started off with a cold open, so right as you turned on the machine, before any credits or titles or anything popped up, you were actually playing the game, which was so ahead of its time. I love this game. I had never played it back in the day. I recently played it for the 16-bit superhero series, and I just couldn't believe how great this game is. And it's much better than the X-Men 1 game that Sega published, because they learned a whole bunch of stuff by the time they made this game. Lots and lots of fun that you're going to have here, especially if you play with somebody else as well. X-Men 2 is my number 1 on my first 5 list. But there you go. There's a whole bunch of first 5 ideas, so probably, I don't know, we have your first 30 games for your Sega Genesis today. I want to thank all of our contributors today. You guys all had incredible ideas, and thank you so much for being generous with your time. And also thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and that subscribe button. Please go ahead and share this with your pals. Thank you for watching today. We will see you soon, and until then, play forever.